kind of work, we often try and partner, that is this class and the Clean Energy Fund, with other groups and organizations in Vermont doing energy, renewable energy, related work. Remember this class, we're interested in this whole idea of an energy transition. How do we get to a different place? And we've talked about a variety of strategies. We've heard from somebody from Germany about what they're doing there. What else have we heard from? It's all a blur. But tonight...
Comprehensive energy plans.
Oh, comprehensive energy plans. We heard what the state of Vermont is doing. Jenny kind of laid us out, Jenny being right here, hi Jenny, kind of gave us the whole big picture of energy transitions that are happening in the past and going forward. Tonight we're going to focus on public policy, laws, rules, regulations, court orders, ways that public policy might even move us forward towards a different type of energy future. And our guest speaker, I got to work with the organization in Vermont that just hosted that big conference on co-sponsoring our guest speaker. So he was the keynote speaker to 400 or 500 people Thursday. Yeah, all the kind of stakeholders in Vermont, renewable energy industry, in a ballroom in the Sheraton Hotel. And tonight he's our featured speaker. He has a long resume that you guys have read. Lots of interesting stuff in there that he's done. But I think mostly what we're talking about tonight is the idea of using carbon taxes as a way to move the energy transition as a public policy lever. So, big warm energy alternatives welcome to Mr. Bauman, our featured speaker.
Do you know how to turn the lights down? Thank you very much. Can we turn these lights down a little bit? Somebody know how to do that? Great. So thank you all for inviting me to join you this afternoon. Perfect. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you today, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Yeah, thanks. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You know, when I told my dad that I was going to be a stand-up economist, he said, Yoram, he said, you can't be a stand-up economist. And I said, why not? And he said, because there's no demand. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. It's just my joke to test how much economics you all know, and then I kind of arrange the rest of my talk accordingly. Unfortunately, I don't have too much time to talk about comedy, but I do want to show you my T-shirt. This is my Enjoy Capitalism T-shirt, made in China. If you look at the tag on the back, it was actually made out of 80% cotton and 20% irony. Dry, clean only. I have one joke that's not about economics that I will share with you right now. It's a joke about speaking Spanish, which I do reasonably well, but not perfectly. As I learned a few years ago, this was well before I was married, and I was in Ecuador practicing my Spanish with a beautiful young woman in a bar, because economists are people too. And finally, she turned to me and she said in Spanish, she said, if you're so great, you know, how come you're not married? And I wanted to say something sort of flirtatiously self-deprecating. You know, like, I don't know, maybe women just don't like me. I thought that was a good line. And what I ended up saying was, tal vez no me gustan las mujeres, which means maybe I don't like women. When I found out what I said, I felt very embarazada, which means pregnant. So to watch out for false cognates. So I'm an economist by training. Somewhere in the course of getting my PhD, I got derailed into doing stand-up comedy for a living, and that is what I now do for a living. I do stand-up comedy about economics. Mostly I do colleges and corporate events. But I did finagle, since I work on climate issues, I finagled a position in China for a semester. I figured I should learn about China if I was going to work on climate issues. So I lived in a housing complex in Beijing. This is a picture of the place where I lived in Beijing. I lived in a housing complex that houses 400,000 people. And this is what it looked like about 5% of the time. Much more often, the view from my apartment window looked like that. Yeah, so some pretty serious pollution problems in China. So these local air pollution problems, not the same thing as climate change, right? But they're sort of correlated. They tend to both be related to fossil fuel consumption. And at this point, I'm actually going to give you, so like I said, I make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics, colleges, and corporate events. And the corporate events are not, I mean, yes, I did the Renewable Energy Vermont conference, but usually I do like the Florida Bankers Association and like the Barry Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's not the Sierra Club. Right, and what I've learned from doing comedy professionally for 8 or 10 years is that if you make people laugh for 45 or 50 minutes, you can kind of talk to them about anything you want for 5 or 10 minutes, and they will give you the time of day. They may not agree with you, but they'll listen. And so I talk to business audiences, often fairly conservative audiences, about climate change and this idea that there's kind of this bipartisan solution to climate change that involves reforming our tax system. And I'm going to give you the same little pitch that I give them. Right? So even though you know all this, but bear with me for a minute. So it starts with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts that this is primarily caused by human activity, right? Burning fossil fuels and deforestation. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. They laughed at that joke more in Texas. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden, and in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more concerned about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we have been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years. The red bars are 10-year average temperatures from the 1880s up to the 1970s. And then there's the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s. For what it's worth, the first few years of this decade, temperatures, I would argue at least, going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, as I tell these groups, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. Right, so what I work on as an environmental economist is using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. Okay, tools of economics, power of capitalism, protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. Now, this is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing. Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and home heating and stuff like that. But there is a side benefit to these policies, other than the main benefit of, potentially saving the world. Right? And the side benefit is if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Okay, government can do all sorts of things with that revenue. And the idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting or revenue neutral tax swaps. The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like pollution, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. Right, and this is an idea that has some appeal across the political spectrum. Even folks like George Will, who he writes for the Washington Post. He's on TV a fair amount, one of these talking heads. Pretty conservative fellow. He came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. Right, and at the time, unemployment was 8.5%. It's now still too high in my view. I hate the payroll tax. Right, and Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. And so I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. In any case, kind of economists across the political spectrum, from like Paul Krugman on the left to both of Mitt Romney's chief economic advisors on the right, think this is a pretty good idea. And there's even a place that's done this. So in the eyes of many economists, the best climate policy in the world, I live over in Seattle. To our north, the Canadian province of British Columbia had a right-of-center government in 2008 that said, look, we want to do something about climate